Welcome to the webinar, the Lux Policy Compass for Medical Devices and Diagnostics. My name is Josh Haslam. I'm Senior Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague Nardev Ramanathan. He's the Associate Research Director here at Lux Research. And throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. And time permitting, we're going to answer as many questions as we can. If your question happens not to get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we'll respond. And if at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, something like that, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. And with that, let's jump into the discussion. Nardev, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Josh. Good day, everyone. For today's webinar, I want to get into why policy is no longer something you manage after the product is built in medical devices and diagnostics, or MDD for short, and I'll continue using MDD to refer to medical devices and diagnostics from here on. Policy is increasingly determining what gets built, where it launches, who can pay for it, how it is updated, and whether it can scale at all. If you are a senior innovation executive or a C-suite leader, this matters because the winners in MDD over the next few years will not simply be the companies with the best technology. There will be companies that can turn policy readiness into commercial advantage. And so that's what I want to do today. I want to do three things today. First, I'll explain the Lux Policy Compass and why it matters now. Second, I'll walk through the major policy impacts across MDD sectors. And third, I'll close with the strategic implications for leadership teams making portfolio, market, and investment decisions. All right, so let's start with the framework itself. Now, you're probably wondering why the Lux Policy Compass, and really the reason to use a compass rather than a long policy tracker is simple. Executives such as yourself really do not need more policy noise, right? You need a way to distinguish what is speculative, what is manageable, and what is going to rewire the economics of the business. And the Lux Policy Compass does exactly that by plotting each policy across a vertical axis represented by business impact and a horizontal axis represented by policy likelihood. Now, the business impact score takes into account how policy developments will impact 6 major aspects of the MDD value chain, namely input, which is the raw material required to develop or manufacture medical technology, but it can also be data and algorithms. Process, which are processes in an MDD, such as regulatory submissions, clinical validation, post-market surveillance, and so on. Product, fairly self-explanatory. Partners and supply chains, which is how policy impacts relationship between key stakeholders. Demand, again, pretty self-explanatory. And finally, incentives, which covers how policies could directly influence investment or launch decisions. The policy likelihood, on the other hand, takes into account how policy developments will impact 3 major areas, namely the policy's current status, whether there's governmental approval, and political volatility. Now, what then this does is it lets us separate this into 4 different quadrants. Now, minimal policies can mostly be watched, whereas evolving policies are the ones that may not fully materialize, but if they do, they can materially change product design, evidence, or workflow integration. Manageable policies are highly likely, but can usually be handled with focused adaptation. You'll see an example later with the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE for short, which is a policy aiming to accelerate medtech growth in the UK, but doesn't necessarily promise ROI. And now, disruptive policies, this is the ones you have to watch, the ones leadership teams just cannot delegate away. These are the policies that force you to rethink product strategy, launch sequencing, reimbursement assumptions, and the very operating model itself. The EU AI Act comes to mind here, which is the world's first AI policy to be ratified. And I'll get into more details on that later on. But that would fall within this quadrant. So the point is not to ask, is this a regulatory issue? The point is to ask, what kind of strategic issue is this and how fast does it move from compliance to competitive advantage or disadvantage? And the Lux Policy Compass can help you do that. Ultimately, the Lux Policy Compass really aims to help answer these three questions, which we hear time and again from our clients. First, how do we avoid unwise risk? In MDD, that means avoiding products that look clinically attractive but cannot survive reimbursement, data governance, AI governance, or post-market obligations. Second, where are the policy-created opportunities? Those often show up where governments create explicit reimbursement pathways, structured assessment routes, or clearer rules for AI-enabled products. And third, when does policy change how, where, when, and with whom we innovate? Now, increasingly, the answer is earlier than most companies think, right? Because policy now influences where you generate evidence, which launch market you choose first, what partners you need, and whether your software and cyber architecture are future-proof. So now let's translate the framework and the policy compass into sector-level implications. Across MDD, the policy burden is not concentrated in one niche alone. It is spreading across precision treatment and care, next-generation point-of-care technologies, healthcare operations, and lab workflows, which are also key priorities within our MDD program here at Lux Research. So I'll be using our Lux Policy Compass to walk you through how policy developments impact each of these four priorities. We will start with building precision treatment and care. Now, we will only go through a subset here. Our actual report has more than double the number of policies that you see here with a more detailed discussion of their impact. So please reach out if you'd like to learn more. However, the 7 policies that we selected here, they cover major policies in major geographies and is a good representation of the more complete policy compass in our report. At a high level, policy developments in this space are increasingly showing that precision care is no longer just a clinical ambition. It is becoming a regulated operating model. Why, you ask? Well, because regulators and payers are converging on life cycle accountability. It is no longer enough to prove that a product works only in a controlled setting. Now, in the UK, you have the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence Early Value Assessment, or NICE EVA for short, that's pushing for more accountability and credibility. And the US is moving quickly to firm up a framework for AI, for software as a medical device, or SAMD. Companies increasingly need to show how the product is governed, updated, monitored, and paid for in the real world. And Asia is absolutely part of that picture. Japan is building around lifecycle governance for AI, for software as a medical device as well. And South Korea and India are doing the same. So the old view that Asia would simply just follow the US and EU later is now becoming outdated. So overall, the policy compass dial here you see is moving towards, or pointing rather towards manageable. But again, it's important to note that this is no guarantee of ROI, which brings me to the NICE EVA example, which I want to get to in the next slide here. Now, the NICE EVA is a very useful way of, or rather very useful example, of why executives need to separate credibility from commercialization. The attractive story is that the NICE EVA accelerates access for promising medtech and digital health products. The harder truth, however, is that the EVA does not guarantee coverage, procurement, or widespread national health services or NHS adoption, which is the single-payer system in the UK. It is an early signal amplifier, not a growth shortcut. Companies still face local commissioning decisions, ongoing evidence expectations, and a fragmented NHS purchasing environment. So while it boosts early credibility, there is no guarantee for NHS adoption. So getting a NICE EVA is strategically valuable, but only if a company is prepared to fund the next stage as well, right? So adoption is still dependent on local NHS purchasing decisions. Now, moving on to a second priority, innovating point of care solutions. At point of care, policy is really doing two things at once. It is making certain models more scalable and reimbursable, while also raising the operational bar. Now, that matters because many executives still treat point of care or POC as a product challenge. They look at miniaturization, workflow fit, usability, but increasingly it is also a system challenge. You need evidence, connectivity, interoperability, security, reimbursement logic, and an implementation model that frontline providers can sustain. Take the European Health Data Space, or EHDS, as an example, right? Or Medicare Remote Physiologic and Therapeutic Monitoring, RPM, RTM. Quite a mouthful there, but one of the major policies in the US, for example. EHDS raises the bar by forcing point-of-care solutions to be interoperable, secure, and electronic health record ready across Europe, not just clinically effective in a silo. And the RPM, RTM in the US raises the bar commercially because to get paid, you need connected devices, reliable data transmission, patient onboarding, and ongoing clinician interaction as well. So the winner is no longer just the smartest, coolest device, but the solution that can operate inside real care workflows. And our dial in the policy compass, where does it point to? It points to the disruptive quadrant, which is why winning in POC will depend less on novelty alone and more on whether the company can industrialize development to stay ahead. And the next policy highlight is a great example of what winning can look like when regulation and reimbursement are well aligned, giving a direct path to market. And this example is one in Japan, right? And Japan's digital therapeutic, or DTX for shorts, frameworks, right? They have a couple of frameworks in place. And Japan is really one of the strongest proofs that digital therapeutics can move from pilot to routine care when regulation and reimbursement are aligned. Japan's model is powerful because approved digital therapeutics, or DTX, can be priced and reimbursed within the national health insurance framework in Japan, rather than being trapped pilot logic, right? And examples here are pretty concrete, right? For example, there's an app called Cure App, which you see here, that's already approved and reimbursable for nicotine dependence, but also there's other indications for hypertension and insomnia as well, right? And it's already in the market, it's being reimbursed. That makes Japan strategically important as a first or early launch market for high conviction products. There are other products that's already been launched in the Japanese market as well. But this is not an easy market. It is a demanding one. Right? Japan shows that real commercialization is possible, but only for products that clear a high regulatory and clinical evidence bar. Right? And South Korea is also following something similar here, where it's aiming to launch a very similar framework in its market as well. So the takeaway for senior executives is this, right? Asia is not just a future growth region, right? It's becoming a policy design lab for digital care. And Japan is one of the markets to really look at if you want to look at a policy aligned market entry for high impact offerings. Now moving on to our third priority, healthcare operations. Now, operational excellence in healthcare is no longer just a best practice aspiration or something that you just see as a motto, right? It is increasingly becoming a regulated capability as well. For software-heavy and AI-enabled products, that means quality systems, monitoring, update protocols, algorithm change, discipline, and resilience are moving from back office concerns into the core of the product value. And there's some examples here. Japan's PMDA, or Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices Agency, artificial intelligence machine learning guidelines, right? Kind of emphasize total product lifecycle thinking, good machine learning practice, as well as change control plans, transparency, and real-world monitoring. And the EU's Cyber Resilience Act, or CRA for short, shows the same operating logic more broadly, right? Products must be secure by design, supported over time, and backed by vulnerability handling, and incident reporting as well. In other words, the market is not just buying a product anymore. It is buying your ability to run that product responsibly over time. Not surprisingly, we have our compass dial pointing to the disruptive quadrant, showing how critical policy developments here are and will be for the healthcare industry moving forward. And the policy highlight I like to touch on for the next one will maybe not be a stranger to many here. It's the EU AI Act. The EU AI Act is one of the clearest signals, right, that clinical AI is moving from innovation to regulated healthcare operations. It's the very first AI policy to get ratified back in 2024. Now, for high-risk medical AI, the EU AI Act extends regulatory expectations into the algorithmic layer itself. That means requirements around data quality, technical documentation, human oversight, robustness, and post-market monitoring as well. The Act entered into force, like I said, back in 2024, but it's being implemented in stages and should be fully effective by the end of 2027. So for leadership teams, it's very important to treat the EU AI Act as a design specifications and not more of a late-stage compliance task. Because if you wait until market entry to retrofit governance, documentation, and monitoring, you will not only burn time, but also potentially capital and credibility as well. And last, but certainly not the least, is we have laboratories to think about as well as one of our priorities. In laboratories, the strategic shift is from efficiency to also continuity. Right? Automation used to be sold mainly on productivity, but increasingly policy and cyber expectations are making it a resilience issue as well. That means workflow design, connectivity, servicing, patchability, and vulnerability response start to matter as much as assay performance or analyzer speed. And the Trump era tariffs show that labs can no longer optimize just for cost because trade shocks can disrupt instruments, reagents, and spare part availability. And the MHRA, which stands for the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in the UK, adopts also a tough post-market surveillance stance where they are showing the same shift from the regulatory side and imposing that view on labs as well, where labs are increasingly required to show traceability and quickly correctable systems as well. So the priority moves from pure efficiency to service continuity and resilience. Now, our policy compass dial, where does it sit? It sits between the disruptive and manageable quadrants, indicating that these policies need to be taken very seriously as well. And the companies that win in the life science industry or other industries that are operating and managing labs will not just automate tasks. They will build closed-loop systems that are secure, maintainable, and operationally dependent. And the FDA's cybersecurity guidance in medical devices is an example I want to highlight in the next slide here. Now, FDA's cybersecurity guidance really makes this very real, what I said earlier, right? It's not just a generic cyber hygiene anymore. There is a move to treat cybersecurity as part of safety and effectiveness, right? Across, software-based bill of materials, the authenticated update mechanisms, threat modeling, testing evidence, and coordinated vulnerability disclosure as well. And that is a major change because it ties secure by design engineering to pre-market and post-market credibility as well. Hospitals are increasingly screening vendors on cyber posture, and legacy architectures may just simply become uneconomic to maintain. So for innovation leaders and senior executives or even C-suite leaders, the real question is not whether cyber compliance costs are going up. They are. The real question is whether you want cybersecurity to be a tax on the business or a differentiator in procurement. So let me close by pulling the dots together in a few key takeaways here. Now, first, the competitive divide in MDD is shifting towards policy readiness. Clinically strong products that cannot meet AI governance, cybersecurity, data control, or post-market expectations will increasingly stall before scale, as policies like the EU AI Act and Japan's DTX or digital therapeutics frameworks show. Second, governance and evidence capabilities are becoming commercial differentiators. Buyers are no longer comparing only features and outcomes. They're comparing whether vendors can support control updates, auditable oversight, secure deployment, and real-world performance monitoring. Now, I talked about the EU AI Act earlier, and I also talked about FDA's cybersecurity guidance, which are good examples of these. And third, rising regulatory scrutiny will force harder portfolio decisions. Some products will deserve more investment because they can meet the new lifecycle standard. Others will not. And leadership teams that avoid those capital allocation decisions will end up subsidizing legacy products that cannot survive the next operating environment. The EHDS, or the European Health Data Space, and the upcoming FDA's AI, Software as a Medical Device, or SAMD, are good examples of this, which again I spoke about. So the final message I would leave with the audience is this. Stop asking whether policy affects innovation and start asking which parts of your portfolio are already misaligned with the policy-defined future of care. And with that, I'll end the talk here today and happy to take any questions.
Great, Nardev, and thanks a lot for that. Very informative. As Nardev said, we're going to be taking questions now that you may have. So remember, please type those into the question box. And if we don't get to your question on this call, someone from Lux will be in touch about the webinar and about your interests. So with that, let me take a look here. Excuse me. So you brought up a lot of different policies here, Nardev, and what do you think is the policy that's going to have the biggest impact on growth in MDD over the next 3 years, sort of sustain the remarkable growth I think we've been seeing throughout medical devices and diagnostics industry?
Yeah, Josh, thanks. That's a great question. I'll take a step back and talk more about, the underlying, feature or aspect that, is something to think about here, right? And I have to really pick one is the shift from one-time approval to lifecycle regulation for AI-enabled and connected devices. And, what policies do that? Well, the one that comes to mind, top of mind in Europe is obviously the EU AI Act, right? That is phasing in. Like I said, it's already ratified back in 2024, and it's being implemented in stages. Most of the rules will be applicable by this August 2026. And for the more high-risk clinical AI that's embedded in regulated products, that will actually will come into force next August in 2027, right? So I think the EU guidance there makes very clear, what needs to be accounted for. And in the US, FDA is already expecting cyber device submissions, and many of these policies that I talked about in the US, like the FDA AI, SAMD, and the CGMD, or cybersecurity guidance, are already in the final stages of being evaluated and hopefully ratified in the years to come.
Okay, excellent. And then I think question that builds on that has to do with, if you were to think about the biggest gap today between innovators' ambition and policy readiness in this industry, right? We have a lot of use of AI. There's a lot of use of sensors and even materials, right, across this. A lot of different things going on with a lot of opportunity. Where does that ambition and policy readiness have the biggest gap today?
Yeah, excellent question. The biggest gap that I really see is between innovation at the prototype stage and readiness at the operating model stage. There seems to be a big gap there. And public guidance is really moving towards managed access. They recognize this gap exists, right? They're trying to, develop policies around that, right? Like I said, moving towards managed access, more sort of continuous evidence generation, and more control product change as well. I spoke about NICE in the UK, where they have this early value assessment, which is designed more to sort of give earlier access, while additional data are being collected and risks are managed, sort of a sandbox environment for them to test things out, right? And FDA's AI guidance also centers on total product lifecycle documentation, monitoring, and change control as well. So the real gap really is not ideas, right? I think there's a lot of ideas around there. It's whether companies can actually prove, maintain, and reimburse those ideas, test it out in the real world so that it can be integrated into existing healthcare workflows.
Okay. So do you think, just kind of one final question building on that, which I think is just my question, is you kind of brought some negativity up to around NICE. That was kind of a positive perspective. So it's nice, kind of just giving innovations a longer runway. Is it kind of creating and maintaining attractiveness as we do this? And that's maybe the best feature of that? Or is it going to be able to help continue that runway as well? Or are we still going to have, as in medical devices, long runways and fairly difficult scaling as you need more and more finances, right, to overcome that sort of innovation gap?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we a lot of these policies are we think going to have an impact, but we also like to call out policies that we want to layer in some, let's say, caution, right? So that not caution, but rather to kind of call it out for what it is. It's really nice. The NICE EVA, the way I like to think about it is that it's more of a dress rehearsal, right? It's more of it provides a setting for you to test things out in a safe environment, but it doesn't mean that it'll necessarily get adopted or reimbursed. But it allows you to test your concept with the main sort of operator in the UK, right? The healthcare operator in the UK, main payer in the UK. And you get to understand and how it aligns with the way they think, right? So if there's any course corrections you need to do, you can do it quickly, and they'll give you feedback quickly as well, right? So the idea is really for you to test that out in an environment that's more collaborative, as opposed to just testing it on your own in your sort of own clinical settings or with your own collaborators, right? So it gives you that opportunity to do that. So, but you should add that layer. We like to add the layer of caution, saying that it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get adopted or reimbursed, but it allows you to test it out, to understand where your
maybe
product
will give you a longer runway. You'll see some better testing. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you, Nardev. I think that's going to conclude it for today. Slides, the presentations from this webinar are all going to be made available to all attendees, sent via an email later today. After leaving the webinar, we always prompt attendees to complete a survey on the presentation. We appreciate any feedback because it helps us to inform and improve future webinars, make them more impactful to all those listening. So beyond that, take a moment, check out our upcoming webinars on our website. And again, thanks for joining us and have a great day.